December 26, 1944. Snow covered the roads leading into Bastogne. Vehicles sat frozen along the shoulders. Some had broken down. Others had been abandoned when fuel ran out. German forces had surrounded the 101st Airborne Division days earlier. The town sat at the center of several key roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement across that part of Belgium. American armored units pushed north through winter weather that slowed everything. Ice made narrow roads dangerous. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Near the front of one column was a tank with the name Thunderbolt painted on the turret. Inside was a battalion commander named Creighton Abrams. Before the day ended, his unit would reach Bastogne. Creighton Williams Abrams Jr. was born in 1914 in Springfield, Massachusetts. His father worked on the railroad. The family lived a steady, practical life shaped by routine and responsibility. Abrams entered the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1932. At the time, the Army still included cavalry units that trained on horseback. But they were not yet the center of Army planning. When Abrams graduated in 1936, he entered the cavalry branch. Horses still appeared in training formations, but engines were beginning to replace them. Army planners knew future wars would depend on faster vehicles with bigger guns. During the late 1930s, the Army began forming dedicated armored units. These new units needed officers willing to work with equipment that was still improving. Early tanks were mechanically unreliable. Crews often spent as much time repairing vehicles as operating them. Abrams transferred into the armored force as the Army expanded because of the war in Europe. The German Army had demonstrated how fast-moving armored formations could break through defensive lines and disrupt supply systems behind the front. American planners began preparing for the same kind of operations. Tank units trained to move long distances, communicate by radio, and operate alongside infantry and artillery. Abrams became known for keeping things simple. Pick a goal and keep moving. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions, he focused on maintaining movement toward the assigned objective. By the time the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Abrams was already positioned in one of the fastest developing branches of the Army. Within a few years, he would command a tank battalion moving across France as part of General George Patton's Third Army. By 1944, Creighton Abrams was serving as a battalion commander in the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. The division became part of General George Patton's Third Army, which was preparing to push across France after the Normandy landings. The Allied breakout from Normandy created an opportunity to move quickly before German forces could form new defensive lines. Third Army moved fast once the breakout began. Roads filled with military traffic as supply vehicles, artillery, infantry, and tanks all moved east. Abrams commanded from a Sherman tank marked with the name Thunderbolt. The name appeared painted clearly on the side of the turret. As earlier vehicles were damaged or worn out, replacement tanks carried the same name. Over time, multiple tanks would serve as Thunderbolt, but the name stayed with Abrams' command vehicle. Moving across France was often difficult. Bridges had been damaged or destroyed during earlier fighting. Engineers worked to repair crossings quickly so armored vehicles could continue advancing. Narrow roads limited how fast units could travel, especially when long columns of vehicles had to pass through small towns. German forces often attempted to slow the advance by destroying infrastructure behind them. Road craters, blown bridges, and scattered defensive positions forced advancing units to adjust routes as conditions changed. The 4th Armored Division became known for covering ground quickly once routes opened. Abrams' battalion participated in advances that pushed east across France toward the German border. The pace of movement meant crews had to maintain their vehicles while still moving forward. Infantry protected tanks from close attacks, while artillery struck defensive positions ahead of the advance. Abrams used radios to keep his battalion moving in the right direction. The rapid advance across France brought American armored forces into contact with German units attempting to slow the Allied push toward Germany. In September 1944, Abrams and the 4th Armored Division would encounter one of the largest German armored counterattacks faced by American forces during the war. In September 1944, German forces launched a counterattack near the town of Arracourt in eastern France. The goal was to slow the Allied advance before it reached the German border. Several German armored units were sent into the area, including formations equipped with Panther tanks. The terrain around Arracourt included open farmland, rolling ground, and small villages connected by narrow roads. Early morning fog often reduced visibility, making it difficult for tank crews to see long distances. Under those conditions, fighting could begin suddenly at close range. The 4th Armored Division moved to meet the German attack. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion took part in the fighting as American forces attempted to prevent German units from regaining the initiative. Abrams' crews used terrain and timing to reduce the advantage of heavier German guns. Limited visibility reduced the distance at which long-range guns could be used effectively. Crews tried to attack from angles that made it harder for German tanks to shoot back. The fighting lasted several days as German units tried to push forward and American forces worked to block them. Fog and rolling ground made it difficult to see enemy tanks until they were already close. American artillery helped disrupt German units as they tried to organize attacks. Communication between units allowed adjustments in positioning as the situation developed. Fighting moved between villages and open farmland, and neither side held a fixed front line for long. German armored forces suffered significant losses during the fighting and were unable to achieve their objective. The counterattack failed to slow the Allied advance in a meaningful way. For Abrams and the 37th Tank Battalion, Arracourt showed how armored units could influence the pace of fighting across large areas. The division continued pushing east as Allied forces advanced toward Germany. Within 3 months, German forces would launch another offensive, this time during winter, in an attempt to disrupt Allied supply lines and divide the advancing armies. In December 1944, German forces launched a major attack through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive began during winter weather that grounded many Allied aircraft and limited visibility across the battlefield. German planners hoped the attack would split Allied forces and slow their advance toward Germany. The Ardennes was not easy terrain for large formations. Roads ran through forests and small towns, often with limited room for passing vehicles. Snow and ice made movement more difficult, especially for heavy equipment. Several American units were caught in the path of the German advance. Near the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units became surrounded after German forces cut off the main roads leading to the area. Bastogne sat at the center of several road networks. Whoever held the town controlled movement across much of the region. German forces attempted to hold the surrounding area long enough to strengthen their position. General George Patton redirected elements of 3rd Army north in an effort to reach the encircled units. Units already moving east now had to turn north toward the Ardennes in winter conditions. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion was part of the force moving toward Bastogne. Progress was slowed by traffic congestion as military vehicles attempted to move along the same limited road network. Some vehicles broke down in the cold. Others slid off icy roads and had to be pulled back into position before the column could continue. Despite these delays, the advance continued. Units moved through towns and wooded areas where road space was limited and visibility was reduced. On December 26, 1944, Abrams' battalion reached Bastogne, becoming the first element of 3rd Army to establish contact with the surrounded American forces. Their arrival reopened a ground route into the town. Supplies and reinforcements could once again reach the units that had been holding defensive positions there. Fighting in the Ardennes continued for several more weeks as German forces gradually withdrew from the area. The relief of Bastogne became one of the most recognized moments of the winter campaign. For Abrams and the 37th Tank Battalion, the fight showed how fast tank units could change direction when needed to meet changing conditions on the battlefield. After Bastogne, the 4th Armored Division continued moving east as Allied forces pushed into Germany. The winter offensive had delayed the advance, but German forces no longer had the strength to stop movement across the front. Abrams and the 37th Tank Battalion returned to offensive operations as conditions slowly improved after the worst of the winter weather. Traffic was still heavy as units moved toward the German border. Abrams' battalion kept moving even when bridges were damaged and roads were blocked. Even so, the advance continued. Abrams' battalion took part in operations that pushed deeper into Germany as German resistance began to weaken. Some German units continued fighting, while others withdrew toward defensive positions closer to the center of the country. As Allied forces approached the Rhine River, engineers worked to establish crossings that would allow heavy vehicles to continue moving east. Once crossings were secured, armored units expanded their positions on the eastern side of the river. By early 1945, German resistance was becoming less organized. Cities and transportation routes fell under Allied control as units moved farther into Germany. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. Abrams had spent the war commanding tank units across France, Belgium, and Germany. His battalion had moved long distances and taken part in several key engagements as Allied forces pushed toward final victory in Europe. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. Army began shrinking almost immediately. Millions of soldiers returned home. Units that had been at full strength only months earlier were reduced or reorganized as the country shifted away from war. Abrams chose to remain in the Army as it adjusted to peacetime conditions. Many experienced officers left military service after the war, but Abrams stayed with tank units as the Army prepared for future wars. In the years that followed, tensions grew between the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe remained a major concern, especially West Germany, where American forces were stationed as part of NATO defenses. Abrams held several assignments focused on training and command. Abrams continued working with tank units as the Army prepared for the possibility of another major war. He later commanded the 3rd Armored Division in West Germany, where American forces maintained readiness as part of the broader NATO presence in Europe. Training exercises focused on making sure units could mobilize quickly if needed. His work focused on keeping units trained and ready. By the mid-1960s, Abrams had reached senior leadership positions within the Army. His World War II command experience remained central to his career. In 1967, Abrams received orders for a new assignment in Southeast Asia, where the United States was already deeply involved in the conflict in Vietnam. In 1967, Creighton Abrams deployed to Vietnam as Deputy Commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. At the time, General William Westmoreland led American forces in the country. The war in Vietnam was very different from the large armored battles Abrams had seen in Europe. Much of the fighting took place in jungle and rural areas with limited roads. U.S. forces conducted operations intended to limit the ability of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units to operate freely in South Vietnam. In 1968, Abrams replaced Westmoreland as overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. His time in command came during a period when the United States began reducing the number of troops deployed to the region. South Vietnamese forces slowly took over more fighting during a process known as Vietnamization. Training programs expanded as South Vietnamese forces assumed a larger role in maintaining security across different parts of the country. American troop levels declined during this period, while advisory and support roles continued. U.S. forces continued operations across South Vietnam, trying to stop enemy movement and maintain control of key areas. Operations were also conducted near border regions where supply routes allowed personnel and equipment to move into South Vietnam. These routes had supported North Vietnamese operations for many years. Abrams remained in command until 1972. During those years, U.S. involvement in Vietnam changed significantly compared to earlier years of the conflict. After leaving Vietnam, Abrams was selected for one of the most senior positions in the U.S. Army, where he would oversee changes affecting how the Army organized and staffed its forces following the war. In 1972, Creighton Abrams became Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The position placed him in charge during a period of transition following years of large-scale involvement in Vietnam. One of the most significant changes during this period was the end of the military draft in 1973. The Army moved to an all-volunteer force, which meant the Army had to rethink how it recruited and trained soldiers. The Army needed enough volunteers to maintain readiness without using the draft. Abrams supported efforts to ensure the Army could continue operating effectively with a smaller active duty force. The Army relied more on the National Guard and Army Reserve as part of long-term planning for a large war. The goal was to ensure the Army could expand quickly if a large war required more soldiers. Abrams served as Chief of Staff until 1974. His career had included Armored Command in World War II, senior leadership during the Vietnam War, and responsibility for overseeing changes in how the Army was organized during the post-draft transition. He died in 1974 while still serving in the position. In 1980, the United States Army introduced the M1 Abrams main battle tank, naming the vehicle in his honor. The tank became one of the primary armored platforms used by the United States and Allied countries, continuing Abrams' connection to American armored forces. Creighton Abrams spent most of his career in armored vehicles, expecting to move quickly under pressure. From the breakout across France to the winter fighting near Bastogne, his battalion took part in operations that required long hours, constant movement, and crews working closely together. After World War II, his responsibilities shifted toward preparing the Army for future conflicts. His time in Vietnam placed him in command during a period when U.S. involvement was beginning to change, changing how forces were trained and deployed. As Chief of Staff, Abrams oversaw structural changes that influenced how the Army organized active and reserve components following the end of the draft. Today, the M1 Abrams moves across modern battlefields, carrying forward the same idea that shaped his career. Pick a goal and keep moving. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Dave.